Recording, and greetings to everybody, and thanks for joining. On the penultimate day of the 2021 McCain Conference, I'm Ed Barrett, Research Director of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy. Our topic this week is the ethics of gray zone operations. On Monday, we explored broad ethical frameworks for determining justified lethal and sublethal responses in the gray zone. And today we'll examine two specific and often related activities, cyber operations and election manipulation. And to help us do so, we have Drs. George Lucas and Jens Ohlin. Dr. Lucas is Professor of Ethics, Emeritus at the Naval Academy and the Naval Postgraduate School. He's also the former Distinguished Chair in Ethics and a current Senior Fellow at the Stockdale Center. He's written 6 books, including Ethics and Military Strategy in the 21st Century, Moving Beyond Clausewitz, and Ethics in Cyber Warfare, The Quest for Responsible Security in the Age of Digital Warfare. And the latter remains the only monograph that I know of on the ethics of cyber warfare. Dr. Ohlin is Interim Dean and Professor of Law at Cornell Law School. Trained as a lawyer and philosopher, his research has tackled questions as diverse as criminal conspiracy, the punishment of collective criminal action, the philosophical foundations of international law, and the role of new technologies in warfare, including cyber warfare, remotely piloted drones, and autonomous weapons. And his most recent monograph is Election Interference, International Law and the Future of Democracy. And as usual to the attendees, please send me questions as they occur to you during the presentations via the chat function. And for the midshipmen, please preface your question with MIDN. So thank you both for joining us. And Dr. Lucas, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. And thank you all for coming today. It's a really great honor for me to be on or part of this program over the past 2 weeks now with such distinguished guests, including our co-host today, Dr. Ohlin, who's very well known in my field and related works as well, related fields as well. I listened to great interest to the first week insofar as I could on the ethics of espionage. And then this week we're talking about the gray zone, and I'm lucky enough to get the topic to talk about that fits nicely into all of the above. It clearly, when we talk, as we did yesterday, about something called soft war with Michael Gross and Tamar Meisels, the University of Tel Aviv and the University of Haifa, respectively, that if soft war means unarmed conflict, well, cyber is clearly a form of soft war. And in their book, they discussed cyber. A couple of authors, myself included, contribute on that. So it's war in the gray zone. Gray zone is pretty wide and pretty ambiguous, but certainly cyber should be at the center of whatever that zone is. Question there would be, well, is it unarmed conflict like war, but just a different form of warfare? And of course, for over a decade, there's been a debate raging, and you will hear from one of the most renowned of the participants in that debate about whether there is or isn't something called cyber warfare, Professor Thomas Rid, now of the School of Advanced International Studies, but a time earlier, a colleague at King's College London when he published his famous works on there is no such thing as cyber war. It's all hyperinflated, excessive talk. And it's more than just an academic debate because, of course, it bears on what we're trying to wrestle with on both of these weeks. What kinds of laws, if any, what kind of rules or principles or norms, which is what I want to talk about today, would apply to cyber conflict if it is or if it isn't war, or when it is as opposed to when it isn't war. So that's a useful debate about war in the gray zone and cyber's role there. And then, of course, whatever else we will decide as a result of that debate on what cyber conflict has been, is now, or will become in the future, there's no way of denying that, at very least, when we're not talking about crime and vandalism and sort of lower level actions like that, malevolent actions, that we're talking about cyber as being a form of espionage, as I like to call it, espionage on steroids. So certainly whatever we conclude about the debate from last week, from Dr. Luban and from Professor Cécile Fabre and Michael Skirker and others who were trying to think through what rules might apply or what principles might be brought to bear, or what norms might be emerging in the practice of espionage and intelligence gathering and covert action. If there are any governing principles that define best practices or limits of acceptable practice to which nations ought to be held, that would probably apply by extension to cyber as well. So we have a good sort of fertile area to till, but at the same time, we have the question that faced us with all of those things as well. Can we really talk about ethics or the rule of law in the cyber domain? Certainly in a domestic sense with regard to normal activity, criminal activity, and the like, we're probably on relatively firm ground. And even in early in this new century, many, not all, but most of the nations who were active in the cyber domain agreed at a conference in Bucharest in 2001, I think, to a set of norms or rules or principles or extrapolations of international law that would guide the behavior of nations responding to criminal activity in the cyber domain, how they could cooperate, what nations are responsible for doing when crime was occurring, when somebody like our famous hacker who worked out of a Starbucks in San Francisco and ran this enormous illegal drug and various other kinds of money laundering, smuggling operation known as the Silk Road. That when you find somebody like that, or you know of something like that going on, what nations are obligated to do to try to find that criminal, that perpetrator, and shut them down, and holding the nations themselves for the first time responsible for criminal activities within their own borders. So that was a major advance in the cyber, in the early on in our history of cyber conflict to deal with crime. But I would say right now, our question is somewhat different. Can we imagine something like that happening with respect to the conflict among and between nations and state actors in the cyber domain? There's our challenge. And frankly, it doesn't at first glance look very promising. This is a domain in which the criminals initially and the vigilantes and the hackers and now the nations who are actually degrading their international behavior to correspond, something I call state-sponsored activism, that instead of building weapons of war in the cyber domain, we've had the nations who would normally build those and use those weapons behaving more and more like the individual vigilantes and criminals. Whatever the case, are there any rules or regulations that would, existing now, that would apply to them? Are there any prospects for coming together at some level to agree that there are certain things we probably ought not to do to one another in the cyber domain? That is, nations and their agents ought not to do to one another and to the citizens of those nations. At present, there's practically nothing. And I want to spend the rest of my about 10 minutes or so talking about what there is, what there isn't, what we've learned, and what remains yet to be done with regard to state actors in the cyber domain. There is, of course, just as there's skepticism from Professor Rid tomorrow about the existence of cyber war, there's skepticism about all the players about the possibility of there being any really meaningful norms or principles of behavior. Now and then, frustrated participants among the nations will call for this. We should have a conference, or we should have a treaty, or we should write black letter law that the United Nations would agree to. Something at least like the Cybercrime Convention of 2001 would be good to have here as well. Others will say, well, good luck with that. We are in a realm where any nation and its cyber warriors can do pretty much whatever they want to whomever else they please, at any time they please, with very little fear of getting outed, attributed, held accountable in any meaningful way. And it seems like a kind of lawless frontier in that respect, a state of nature. Actually, in my work, I've argued that while this description seems accurate, it's also kind of interesting from the standpoint of those of us who work in philosophy, political philosophy, and the history of political philosophy, in that it's the first real, genuine, global state of nature we've encountered. Even though it's a virtual world, still the behavior of the actors and agents in that world is very much like something Thomas Hobbes would have described 4 centuries ago in the Leviathan, a war of all against all. And it remains to be seen whether life will be, as a result, nasty, brutish, and short, or whether there'll be some transition out of that state of nature into something at least more stable, either a massive hegemon, the United States or Russia or China, some powerful nation would gain so much control over behavior in the cyber domain that they could dictate terms to inhabitants, in quotes, of that world. That would be one possibility, a leviathan of the cyber domain. Or perhaps there could be something more like what Hobbes himself envisioned for the mythical original state of nature, which would be a transition to civil society defined by a kind of tacit contract. And the mystery, as always in Hobbes, is how is that going to happen? Hobbes himself is a little vague about that. It's the only thing he describes as something approaching a moral obligation in the state of nature is to get out of it, to quit it, as he says, as quickly as we can. And I think there's agreement in the cyber domain that we would like to be in a better, more stable relationship with one another there than we are now, especially when, as in the last few months, the United States and its assets were severely compromised by what appears, and pretty clearly is, a Russian massive attack, the SolarWinds attack, the nature of which has been described ruefully by some of our espionage experts as perhaps the greatest single exfiltration of information and damage done to vital security systems ever achieved. So certainly espionage and covert action on steroids. So we'd like something better, but what is it going to be? Apart from retaliating, and which we've just begun to do this past week, as President Biden established some sanctions and other forms of punishment on Russia, who denies, of course, as all cyber perpetrators, malevolent perpetrators do, deny that they were responsible. We didn't do it. Somebody else did. And it's hard to move beyond that tiny level of uncertainty to marshal some effective sanctions for this. So that's the problem we need to work on. How can we go about that? Well, one way is, as I mentioned, to have some kind of a contractual arrangement where the parties to the dispute come together and agree to terms. And I'd say my own guess is I'd be interested in what Professor Ohlin has to say and others on this if we get to that conversation. But I just think there's very little prospect for writing any new law or treaties, unless, as some of the worst of the most pessimistic skeptics will say, unless there is such a cataclysmic apocalyptic event in the cyber domain as to drive us of necessity to do that. And the costs of that would be terrible indeed. So absent that incentive, what else is there? One of the things I've been interested in watching over the course of several years is sort of plotting the trajectory of milestone cyber events, malevolent events. The hacking, for example, by the Chinese PLA unit of the Office of Personnel Management in 2015. That affected many of us here that are on these screens personally. Our data were stolen. Our personnel files were exfiltrated. Now, what the Chinese have done with those since is not entirely clear. And remains to be seen, was that just a demonstration of power? We can do this and you can't stop us, so you better watch your step? Or are they yet today plotting some kind of major attack on particularly those whose personnel records reveal them to be important, perhaps covert operatives or major senior diplomatic officials who could be blackmailed in some way? And you move on backwards in time to the initial, what was called at the time, the initial event of cyber warfare, the attack on Estonia, presumably by the Russians, who once again denied it. And if you remember the discussion during the previous presidential administration of the 400-pound fat man sitting in his underground office engaged in cyber hacktivism, somebody like that did that, carried out that cyber attack, or some disaffected Estonian kid or whatever. And this is the nature, the difficulty of these activities, these malevolent activities in cyberspace. Is we imagine that they could be carried out sometimes anywhere from someone who was an individually alienated hacker or teenager, all the way up to a massive group like the Russians, the Chinese have, and even the North Koreans and the Iranians. A team of dedicated, very intelligent, highly trained, well-resourced cyber warriors at work on doing this. Anything seems to be possible, and would respond differently to those different kinds of actors in terms of holding them accountable for what they did. So we move from Estonia and the Israeli attack on the Syrian radar air defense systems in 2007, I believe it was. So that all sounds a long time ago. And my book on cyber warfare was written when those were still reasonably current. So now it's completely overtaken by events that the Russians have interfered in our election in 2016, even though the elected president at the time claimed it was probably just a 400-pound alienated guy. That interference has continued. We know that. The Chinese pulled this stunt with stealing records, and they've done many other things since. The NotPetya software, the ransomware, it was used primarily against, again, by Russians, presumably against Ukraine in particular, but was kind of a reckless program because it was not well contained. Collateral damage was widespread from that. And so you go until the SolarWinds attack. Put all that on a timeline and then figure out what the parameters are you'd like to plot. Things like intensity, agency, accountability, damage done, collateral damage done, and so forth. Can we discern any pattern? That's my question. This is an inductive question. Can we look at that, stare at that? Because if we're not getting people together at the table to pass laws or agree to terms of a convention, this is all we've got, actual behavior. What are people, or rather nations, and their cyber agents doing in the cyber domain that might tip us off as to what we could hope for in the way of norms of responsible state behavior, standards by which we might, at least in a provisional, fairly weak, but at least existing way, hope to reinforce, establish, recognize, comply with, and hold people accountable for failure. hold nations accountable for failure. I guess the big question is, can we hope for something like that? We know that's happened in international law over the course of centuries. We hold people now in the 20th and 21st century to much higher standards, hold nations to much higher standards of conduct than we used to. And we have better and better ways, as Professor Milt Regan was discussing in one of his sessions last week, I think, of reinforcing that through shaming, sanctions, public attention, and so forth, which is the hallmark of enforcement of international norms, international law in this case. If we proceed inductively, as I'm suggesting, and with this I'll wrap it up, can we see anything that we might hope for, particularly after this most devastating attack? Well, there's some things that might constitute unacceptable behavior that we can condemn. And that would be attacks that are indiscriminate and aimed not at primarily military targets, but at the general civilian population. Ransomware, WannaCry, for example, and the North Korean attacks on British healthcare institutions, which was the initial use of that purloined software from the National Security Agency, was to hold hospitals hostage and have their records risk being destroyed, or at least withheld from them, if they didn't fork over what turned out to be a ridiculously small amount of money, which is why I thought as soon as I heard it, it has to be the North Koreans. It's not some cyber criminal. They'd want more in the way of ransom. And it turned out a week later, that's who it was. That's an indiscriminate attack. And it is not proportional to particularly any harm that was suffered that might justify it. So you could say, maybe in the negative, we're seeing in some of these attacks the demand that there be a good reason for them, that they be aimed at military targets, not at civilians, that they be proportional to the harm that you're alleging justifies the attack or the offense or whatever it is. And finally, that the instruments used, the cyber weapons employed, the malware, whatever it is, be designed in such a way that it doesn't escape into the wider environment and just do indiscriminate damage to all sorts of people with whom you have no quarrel. Just stop and think about that for a minute. Are those unreasonable demands to make? They may sound, especially to the midshipmen right now, familiar, like they sound like just war criteria. Well, they're not. I mean, they are and they aren't. You're not applying a theory from one domain to another or claiming that this is warfare and so just war should apply. It's rather that these are general principles that we use, as Dr. Wetham from King's College would say, anytime there's harm that we're contemplating doing, we should employ these standards, that you have to have a really good reason and you need to be careful that your damage or your attack or whatever is proportional to the harm you've suffered and not hit innocent parties, not be indiscriminate and so forth. It seems like, A, there are those principles that emerge and nations complain when they're violated, and they also can be respected. They can be complied with. Stuxnet, a weapon, and Dooku and Operation Olympic Games followed all those criteria. They were aimed at military targets only. They killed no one else and damaged very little other than the target. When they escaped in the wild, insofar as they didn't do much damage, and they weren't really reversible engineering so that vigilantes or criminals could use them, it turned out. That's a pretty good way to go, as opposed to the attacks on like WannaCry. So with this, I conclude simply that you can see patterns that can be discerned and reinforced. You can complain, as I somewhat pessimistically do, that we're not seeing enough progress in those. But I think we'll have to see how, when SolarWinds is assessed, the extent to which it has complied with those norms or standards, emergent norms, or whether it has gone across some red line of unacceptable behavior. as the United States is now arguing and deserves to be, punished or called out and condemned. That's where we are. That's how the terrain looks at present. And there's clearly a lot of work to be done. But I hope there's some hope for optimism that necessity, if nothing else, will drive us there. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, George. Remove spotlight. And Dr. Ohlins, we have our rapt attention.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and to address you and participate in this conversation. Both to share the virtual stage with Professor Lucas, whose work I admire greatly, but also very honored to be in the same company as a lot of members of the audience who are notable scholars in their own right and whose work has illuminated me on many occasions. So thank you for having me here. I'll just start maybe by saying a couple of words about the overall topic that I'm going to be discussing, election interference, and try and situate it before I go into specific remarks. I want to situate it within this overall theme that you've been exploring during this symposium and conference. So, I think that both law and philosophy and ethics have very much had trouble dealing with types of conflict which fall below the threshold of armed conflict or war. And I think there's multiple reasons why that has been so. And in particular, one reason for the difficulty is that a lot of philosophers as well as lawyers have an impulse that the permissive rules regarding warfare should be cabined as strictly as possible to a very defined set of circumstances. So the criteria by which we apply the word war or armed conflict or any of those labels is fairly strict, because there's always this concern that the relatively permissive rules sort of bleed into everyday affairs. So we want to keep it tightly constrained. Now, of course, when I say permissive, I don't mean to suggest that in war or in armed conflict everything is permitted. But when you judge it relative to the standards which govern day-to-day affairs, you might say more is allowed in terms of the use of force and lethality. And that's a kind of scary possibility for a lot of people. Now, while that does some things very well, it provides a nice tight definition of what war is, and it limits the rules of armed conflict or warfare to very small set of events. It produces this collateral consequence, which is we don't really know what to do with all of these other sorts of conflict which fall below the threshold. And I think that's very much what we're sort of confronting in today's society, whether it's spying or cyber conflicts, or what I'm going to talk about, election interference and disinformation operations. There's a kind of uncertainty about how to deal with them. I think there's one school of thought in at least in international relations which doesn't really have that much of a difficulty dealing with them, because realists and other international relations scholar who see states as in a sort of ongoing eternal state of conflict with each other, they don't really recognize much of a distinction between peacetime and conflict, whether it's cyber conflict. They just see conflict everywhere. Just everything is always in conflict. But at least for the rest of us who are inclined to sort of make a distinction between peacetime and these other forms of conflict, we're sort of troubled with this categorization and we're unsure whether or not we should just stick with two categories, or whether or not there needs to be a sort of richer framework to develop these questions. Okay, so that's where I think election interference sort of fits in with your overall theme of these events. Let me now sort of turn to my particular theory on election interference and disinformation operations generally. So I've been thinking about this for probably 4 or 5 years. ever since the 2016 election. I wrote some essays. I then ended up writing this monograph that Ed mentioned, which is Election Interference, International Law and the Future of Democracy. And then I also worked on this book, which is called Defending Democracies, which also includes a chapter by Duncan McIntosh, who's I believe on the call. But in these articles and books, I've really tackled three questions, and I'll sort of lay them out for you now, or tackle 3 points. The first point is whether warfare or armed conflict is a useful framework for discussing or thinking about election interference. And the answer to that question is a resounding no, in my view. The second question that I tackle is whether sovereignty as a conceptual category is a convincing framework or a useful framework for understanding election interference and disinformation operations. And while a lot of scholars support sovereignty as a useful framework for many reasons, I am sort of a counter trend, and I say, actually, no. I think that sovereignty, while it at first appears to be a useful framework, turns out to be strangely complicated and messy, certainly from the perspective of legal doctrine. It doesn't really help analyze the problem. And then the third question I'll talk about is, well, what's the alternative? And my proposed alternative is self-determination. And so I'm going to make a pitch for suggesting that self-determination is a much better framework for understanding election interference. And then I think I'm going to conclude at the very end with some notes of concern about what my entire analysis leaves out, which is domestic threats of disinformation, which I've grown increasingly concerned about over the last, I'd say, year and a half. Okay, so warfare, in particular cyber war. A lot of people in the public, as well as politicians, when they talk about election interference, the first thing they will sometimes gravitate towards is the language of warfare or armed conflict. This was particularly pronounced after the 2016 election. A lot of politicians and a lot of people in the lay press said what happened in the election, and this goes for Republicans as well as Democrats, anyone who objected to what Russia did in the 2016 election by meddling through everything from troll farm activity being run out of the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia, or Facebook advertisements, viral disinformation on Facebook and the like. All of that taken together, a lot of politicians said that constitutes an attack against our country. It's an example of cyber war. And while I want to sort of, concede that at first glance there's a plausibility to that claim, at least from a legal perspective, and I think also a conceptual perspective, I'm in the sort of camp that Professor Lucas mentioned before, which thinks that cyber war is often sort of misused, and there's a lot of things which are described as cyber war which I don't really think deserve the label. If you look just at the legal category for how the rules of armed conflict apply in the cyber domain, the emerging consensus, although it's again not a universal consensus and there's disagreement on both sides of this, on either sides of the spectrum, but the emerging consensus is that the rules governing armed conflict, whether you're talking about jus ad bellum, resort to force, or jus in bello, the rules regarding the conduct of hostilities, those rules can apply in the cyber domain, but only in limited circumstances. And those circumstances are where there is some type of physical destruction or loss of life or loss of limb to individual human beings. It's certainly the case that a cyber attack can meet those criteria. You can launch a cyber attack which causes a power station to overheat and blow up and cause an explosion, and then there's damage to a physical installation, and it could even cause loss of life. And I think in those circumstances, it's kind of uncontroversial that a cyber war or that the cyber attack would constitute a cyber war. But often, cyber wars don't have that type of physical destruction. At most, there's maybe a disabling of a computer system, although even, a lot of the cyber attacks that we care about, there's actually not even a disabling of the computer system or the network system. There's simply just an attack which has some sort of negative consequence, but it doesn't involve physical destruction, loss of life, or disabling a computer system. And certainly, and this is the key point here, whatever you think about these points, the type of cyber attacks that are implicated in election interference, where there's meddling of the type that Russia and other countries are now starting to do. I mean, one thing I want to just sort of say quickly here, this isn't just a story about Russia in 2016. This is a mode of statecraft which is increasing in popularity, and a lot of countries are now using it, in part because there's a big impact for a small expenditure of resources in terms of manpower and in terms of money. You can accomplish a lot with a very small footprint. So I think it's not just Russia. But in any event, whether you're talking about Russia in 2016 or other countries, right? There's no physical destruction. There was no loss of life. That's not the distinctive harm associated with the cyber attacks that were involved in the election interference. Spreading disinformation, using advertisements to, amplify a particular divisive view, encouraging people not to vote, encouraging boycotts of voting, all of these types of strategies. There's just no plausible way, I think, of legally or conceptually describing that as a cyber war. So for all those reasons, I think bucket one, cyber war, not a good framework for talking about election interference. Now, let me move on and talk a little bit about the second option, which is sovereignty. And immediately, I think a lot of people sort of jump to that. Okay, election interference, not a violation of the rules of armed conflict, but it's a violation of sovereignty. And that, I think, that a language of a sovereignty violation was used not only by a lot of people in the popular press and politicians, this was a violation of US sovereignty. Also, I think a lot of scholars are inclined to pull the concept of sovereignty off the shelf and use it as a framework for understanding election interference and say, well, okay, maybe Russia didn't violate Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, but they did violate US sovereignty. The problem with that framework is that the legal criteria for what counts as a violation of sovereignty turn out to be very technical, some might say hyper-technical, very strict, and don't really describe cases of election interference, not just the ones we've encountered, but any example of a disinformation campaign. What do I mean by that? Well, the law has, really had a hard time articulating, what is a violation of sovereignty and what is not a violation of sovereignty? What is a violation of the principle of non-intervention? In a sense, it's understandable that this is difficult for the law to deal with because, everything can be a violation of sovereignty if you describe the protection of sovereignty too broadly, because countries are constantly doing things which have an impact, have an effect on other countries. And that by itself is not enough to describe, a state's behavior as a violation of another state's sovereignty. So there's this question of, well, what exactly is the dividing line? What's that point that you can't cross? And I think international lawyers have not done a very systematic job of articulating that line. But the few things that they've sort of said definitively are that there are these very defined circumstances where you can have a violation of sovereignty. Something counts as illegal under international law. One example is where there's coercion. And that was the standard that was articulated by the International Court of Justice in the famous Nicaragua case. And the standard was articulated by the World Court that if what a country does has this kind of coercive impact on another state, it coerces them into doing something that they really didn't want to do, not because of the economic consequences, but because of some kind of military or physical consequence, then that's a violation of the sovereignty. You remember Nicaragua was all about like laying mines in the harbors and stuff like that. The problem here is that, whatever went wrong with election interference, or whatever the distinctive harm is of election interference, it's hard to describe it using the language of coercion. I mean, was Russia or any other country that interferes in our election, are they trying to coerce us? Who exactly is the one that's being coerced? It's not like they're holding a gun to the, heads of the people who voted and say, vote this way or else. No, it's not doing that. They're manipulating the information and the discourse available to the people. So it's a form of deception, perhaps. Although, again, it's tinkering with the deliberative mechanism of democracy, but that doesn't sound to me like coercion. The other avenue, which is explored, for example, in the Talon manual, is this other criteria which is sometimes used, that there can be a violation of the principle of non-intervention if a foreign state usurps an inherently governmental function. So something that a local state does, which is part of the business of governing, and that power is usurped by a foreign nation, then you can think of that as a violation of sovereignty, or a violation of the principle of non-intervention. Well, you could imagine, I suppose, some types of election attacks which might qualify. So if another country were to interfere with the process of actually holding the election on an election day, tampered with the voting machines, or tampered with the tabulation of the votes on election day, or even tampered with the process of registering people to vote, then I could see, well, maybe there's an interference in this inherently governmental function, because the registration of people to vote is a governmental function, and the counting of votes is a governmental function. But the problem is that's not really what Russia was accused of doing, and those aren't the cases that really bother me as an international lawyer. The ones that bother me are the ones that involve social media disinformation. So for all of those reasons, sovereignty, I think, is just not a very good framework. Now, I want to put two little footnotes to this discussion. One is that my answer here is a little bit legalistic, and so I'm a little bit more sympathetic to a philosophical discourse around sovereignty, which might, I think, be a plausible framework. It's just not going to be much of a good use for international lawyers. So at this point, I want to make one separation there between the ethical philosophical discourse and the legal discourse. The second thing I want to say is that the word sovereignty is a very capacious term, and it's a bit of a cluster concept. And the word sovereignty is used in a lot of different contexts to mean different things. And so what I'm really sort of dispensing with is that very legalistic definition of sovereignty. Sometimes people use the phrase, particularly in political theory, use the phrase sovereignty to mean popular sovereignty, like the will of the people, in the sense of which we might say, in the United States, it's the people themselves who have sovereignty because that's what legitimates our government. I'm not throwing out that sense of sovereignty, because I actually think that sense of sovereignty actually affords fairly well with what I'm going to talk about in my third part when I talk about self-determination. But the only thing I would say is this notion of popular sovereignty, whatever it means, is not really what lawyers mean when they use the phrase sovereignty. It means something else, but I like it very much. Okay, so where does this leave us? Where does that? Where do we end up at the end of the analysis? My suggestion is that the better framework for understanding disinformation operations is the principle of self-determination. So all peoples have a right of self-determination. That's a universally recognized right under international law. although the consequences of that right are often underexplored by lawyers. It shows up a lot in the context of secession, as well as decolonization. That's usually the context when people talk about self-determination. Also, we've got a colony. It's being ruled by a parent state. The colony perhaps has a valid claim of self-determination. And so if they want to exercise a kind of nationalistic campaign to achieve independence, that should be supported by the world community. That's the context where people usually talk about self-determination. My view is that self-determination is a right that peoples have, and it endures, even beyond the point when they become a state. So when a people gain statehood, you can then talk about the legalistic rights that that state has under international law, but you can also still talk about the right that the people have under international law, and one of those rights is the right to self-determination. What does that mean in the context of a democracy? I think that the institution of an election in a democratic system is the fulfillment of a people's right of self-determination. It's the manner by which they exercise their decision about their own destiny. They come together every few years, whether it's 1 year or 4 years or 5 years, depending on the country, and they make certain decisions about how they're going to be governed. And that is the exercise of their right of self-determination. What this means is that if another state comes in and interferes with the process of deliberation, that is an interference in the right of self-determination, because in a democratic society, self-determination is actualized through an election. And it's not just cyber meddling. There are all sorts of boundary regulations that states engage in order to ensure that their election only expresses the will of their own people and not the will of outsiders. So we have rules about voting. Foreigners can't vote in the election. You don't allow someone who's all the way off in Norway. They can't vote in a US election. Well, why not? Because the whole point is that the election is supposed to express the will of the American people, not the will of people in Norway. No offense to people in Norway. Also, campaign finance regulations. We have rules about who can spend money on our election, because again, we don't want that foreign interference. The Foreign Agent Registration Act, FARA, says that if a foreign power has agents operating in our country, lobbying on their behalf or engaging in activities on their behalf, that has to be disclosed to the State Department, so we know who is doing what on whose behalf. I think all of these are examples of sort of transparency and ensuring that our political process is respected. And I think covert cyber interference through social media disinformation violates that norm, in particular because the cyber disinformation was not just meant to change the deliberation of the political system, but here's the important point. It was done covertly, in the sense that it wasn't someone on the internet saying, I'm in Norway, this is my view on US politics. It wasn't that. It was a troll farm being set up by the Russians with people pretending to be Americans, presenting their views about US politics and not doing so transparently. So they were hiding their identity and pretending to be insiders, masquerading as insiders when in fact they were outsiders. That, I think, there's a plausible claim that that is a violation of the norm of self-determination. Okay, that sort of concludes the third point. The last thing I want to say, and then we can transition to people's comments and questions for both of us, is that one thing that this analysis doesn't solve is what to do with purely domestic disinformation, right? So who cares if the Russians are doing this or 50 other countries are doing this if the president of the United States is just going to do it directly on social media and push out conspiracy theories, disinformation. I'm not just picking on the president. I mean, any politician, if they're going to do it directly, my analysis, which is really focused on foreign actors, isn't going to speak to this issue of domestic disinformation. And I'll just leave that as a question that I find troubling. And I would like to come up with a good answer to it. And it keeps me up at night, but I don't have a theory that really explains why that is problematic or illegal and how we should address it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jens. That was, yeah, that was really helpful. I'm going to make some adjustments here. Bring George back. And spotlight. Okay. So I had just one question, a quick one, Jens, then. It sounds like then there are two sins involved in this interference with self-determination. I mean, the interference itself and then the covert part of it too. And you could have some interference that isn't covert, but that would still be a problem. But my general question is, could the reduction of self-determination be a cause then for war, for lethal response? That's the question I've been, struggling with, and I just don't know. I tend to say no, regardless of the outcome and the means, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've kind of answered. You've predicted what my answer is going to be, which is one consequence of me moving it out of the war box and into the self-determination box is precisely to say that this behavior is wrong. It's illegal. There's a way of describing its distinctive harm, but it doesn't call for an armed response because it doesn't trigger that that warlike response. So that's exactly the sort of end result of the analysis, because it doesn't involve an armed attack. That doesn't mean it's not troublesome, and that doesn't mean there aren't things that that a country can do. But as I'm sure you've discussed over the course of this symposium, there are countermeasures, reprisals, economic sanctions, right? Other forms of collective coercive behavior that the international community can take, which don't necessarily involve, launching missiles or launching attacks.
Right. Although in some cases, violence might result from this interference, and then the conversation about a violent response becomes a little more plausible. But still, I'm very reticent to go in that direction myself. Okay. Yeah. Well, we had some questions come in. Valerie, are you there still?
I am.
Why don't you pose your question to George?
Sure. I lost it when I fell out of the meeting, so I'll have to try to reconstruct it. But I was wondering, thinking about kind of how civilian immunity might apply to cyber war or cyber conflicts or cyber whatever we're going to call them today. So on the one hand, I can see why some things should be completely off limits. So targeting hospitals and interfering with patient care. But I wonder if you make any distinction between some sorts of targeting that might be mallow and sage, just so bad you can't ever aim anything at a civilian, no matter what, or if the kind of harm matters. So one might think of physical harm to the person. One might think of permanent harm to their property if it's stolen or damaged, right? So stealing their data or destroying their data or stealing from them by ransomware, right? Where they have to pay in order to keep the data. But then there might be a third case where maybe you could freeze their data for a day or two, right? To coerce them. Is that kind of coercion as bad as all of these other things because it's touching a civilian? Or in the cyber world, are things maybe a little bit different? I don't know. It was meant to be a question. I'm sorry.
No, it's a really important point, and I think among the knottiest that we face, knowing that, and this is in part because of this gray zone area of cyber somewhere between legitimate warfare or conventional warfare and espionage. And in espionage, we know that the targeting of civilian targets is widespread and is not universally condemned. That is, they are exploited, they are deceived, they are recruited, so forth by, as we heard last week during all those excellent productions and discussions. And it wasn't clear exactly. There were some rules that emerged in that case about saying, well, yeah, to exploit and deceive, that's not sufficient harm to render that behavior in the espionage intelligence community off limits. But what might be is if you do so in a way that is coercive, that is blackmail or threats or something that, as opposed to appealing to someone's vulnerabilities and their mother needs medical treatment or something. I think a similar kind of distinction might work in the cyber domain, in that, talk about mala inse, I think the attack on the Israeli water treatment plant, which, if successful, this was what, about a year or two ago, if that had been successful, that would have resulted in illness and death and major harm. I think that would have been an illicit act, a casus belli. I think it would have been taken as such by the government. And that sort of thing, if you can identify some of the worst kinds of death, injury, widespread death and injury from a cyber attack against non-combatants, against people against whom you have only the thinnest plausible line of justification for making them a target. Versus ransomware, then again, ransomware, what are you ransoming? Healthcare and people's well-being, I think, are probably off limits, and thus WannaCry and the North Korean attack were crossing a line. How about Estonia, when assets were frozen and access to the government was limited or cut off? That is the first one that raised this question, and we've never kind of resolved it because it got tied up with another one about whether this really happened and whether it was brave enough or not. I tend to believe that it was an attack and it was an act of war, and it could have been taken as such, but probably would have been wise not to. And it wasn't, and it didn't last long enough to do any grave and major harm. And certainly those attacks in and of themselves, those tactics of cyber weapons, are not mala in se. So I think with some work and good faith, people can sort these things out and make the distinctions that your question called for, better and worse forms of legitimate attack on non-military targets. Pause there and see if there are other reactions.
Thanks, George. Jens, did you want to weigh in on that?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay, good. All right, we have a question from, I'm going to mispronounce your name again, Biba. How do you correct it?
It's Beba, but thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for trying. Thank you both for great presentations. I have a question for Dr. Ohlin. I'm extremely sympathetic to your project, and I find the arguments for why election interference doesn't fit into the war paradigm or the sovereignty paradigm compelling. I'm having some trouble understanding the positive argument about self-determination. And I have two brief questions. One is the conditions you put forward about covertness and the foreignness of actors and disinformation. Do you take all of them to be necessary and jointly sufficient for rendering something a kind of impermissible influence on a self-determining democracy? Or do we just need one of them or two of them in order for the influence to be impermissible? And then the second question, I'll throw it out because it's brief. When we're thinking about state actors impermissibly interfering in a democracy, what kind of affiliation would a state adjacent actor need to have in order for their involvement to also be impermissible? So I have in mind, citizens of another country who might be engaging in debate, writing for news columns, whatever, perhaps even covertly online, posting on Twitter or whatnot, So what degree of separation would we need for their participation to be permissible and not impermissible? Thank you.
Those are great questions, and thank you for the opportunity to answer them, because it allows me to sort of fill out some of the details that I didn't provide in my presentation. So the conditions that I outlined are necessary conditions, both of them. And then I think there might be another condition that you would have to add for something to be sufficient. But just let me briefly focus for a second on the covertness. That is a necessary condition for this to be impermissible from my point of view, both legally and ethically. And if it wasn't covert, then I don't find it problematic. So that's an absolute requirement. Now, why? I have no problem if Benjamin Netanyahu wants to come to Washington, D.C. and give a speech before a joint session of Congress and say, this is my view, this is the position of the government of Israel. I think that the government of the US should do X, and I think that the people of the United States should do Y in the next election. Now, it might ruffle some feathers, and people might complain politically or diplomatically that that's a little bit too blunt of a message. But I don't have a problem with that. It's him basically saying, this is what I think as a representative of Israel, what you guys should be doing. Totally fine with me. It's not fine if Benjamin Netanyahu covertly, does that without identifying himself as an outsider. And so he pretends to be an American and infiltrates that discourse. So for me, that is a necessary condition, that covertness. And it's precisely what troubles me. And you can extend it from the less extreme or simplistic example of the speech before Congress to social media. I have no problem if someone in Russia or some other country is transparently identifying themselves as Russian and engages with that point of view and says, this is my view about Russian politics, and this is my view about Norwegian politics, this is my view about US politics. Totally fine with that. It's when they pretend to be an American that it sort of crosses a line. So it's a necessary condition. Now, I also think that in order for it to be sufficient, there's also something else that you probably have to add to it as well, which is some kind of impact. I think if one person puts up one tweet, that's not going to be enough. It's not going to have an impact. So I think that there is a kind of impact criterion here, which is only going to show up if there's a large-scale campaign. Now, I don't think it's necessary, by the way, that you prove that it altered the outcome of the election. I think that's not necessary. What it is it's the alteration of the deliberative discourse that I find troublesome, and it has to have altered the deliberations. So that's the impact. But actually changing the outcome of the election, I think that's too burdensome of a requirement in the analysis. Now, the connection to a state, which is the last thing the second part of your question, I think that's incredibly important. If it's private citizens who are doing this behavior, it's completely uncoordinated, then I think that there's something distasteful about it, but it doesn't really implicate the machinery of international affairs and of international law. What you really need, though, is some kind of connection to the state. Now, I'm going to leave it open a little bit what that connection needs to be, but there has to be state involvement. So either state funding of the effort, which a troll farm clearly is, state expenditure like payroll. That's just the most obvious one, right? When the state is cutting a check and putting 50 people in a big gymnasium and saying, log on to your computer and get to work, and I want to see you typing from 9 to 5, and then I'm paying you at the end of the day. That's clearly state involvement. Now, you can come up with all sorts of difficult thought experiments where maybe they encourage people to do stuff, but they're not directly employing them, so on and so forth. Those are gray lines, and I might have difficulty answering some of them. But I think it's very easy for me to state that there's state involvement on the one hand when they're actually paying them, or paying them through an intermediary, as they did with the IRA. And on the other hand, if it's completely uncoordinated behavior, then I don't think that it's a violation of self-determination. If it's just random citizens in Russia who want to do this behavior on their own and it's not coordinated at all, then I don't think it's illegal.
Well, thank you, Jens. A question to George from Pat Lynn, I think, about hacking back. At least that's one aspect of the question, right, Pat?
Yeah. Hey, George, how are you? And
Hey, Pat, you're the
and
contact, so.
and hi Jens. I'm sorry my camera's off. I'm on California time and the caffeine hasn't fully kicked in yet. But this question actually can go to either of you because both of you had made comments related to this. So this is a gray zone problem, a question about a gray zone problem that affects non-combatants. So I'm increasingly convinced that even speculating that a hack might be quote unquote cyber war, that might be bad. Not just because it might overstate what's going on. I think both of you share that opinion, but it also seems to be hurting real organizations. So specifically, I'm thinking a hack company's insurance policies won't cover acts of war, right? It also won't cover acts of God and other things. So those victims can't easily get help. So how do you think this should be addressed? So for instance, should the federal government help compensate victims, especially if there's a state obligation to defend against cyber attacks? Or can we establish some guidelines before something can be called or even speculated as cyber war? And what would those even look like? Especially if you think attribution isn't enough, but intent also needs to be established. Or is it all up to us to defend our own systems? So letting victims absorb the costs might be an appropriate incentive. If so, and I think George mentions this a little bit, I mean, if so, does this mean we're in a cyber state of nature and we're admitting that the state can't protect us? Or maybe the insurance companies might just need a more nuanced understanding of what war is or some other solution. Any thoughts about that? Sorry,
George,
big question.
That's a big question. George, you want to go first or do you want me to go first? I'll start off and then hopefully George will come up with better thoughts than I do. I mean, in general, I think that the state has a big role to play here. And one of my big pet peeves is that I think the state has difficulty responding outside of two boxes. So something is in the military box, and I think the United States is more comfortable with how to respond. Okay, we're assigning the authority to the NSA and Cybercom, and this is a military issue. And then I think also on the other side of the spectrum, if something involves financial or pecuniary loss, then we've got domestic sort of legal regulations that apply to that. There's liability rules, at least if a vendor is negligent and suffers some sort of cyber attack, and there's disclosure rules that apply and so on and so forth. But for everything else that's in between, I think people are kind of stymied. And I think that's my sort of general answer, which is there needs to be more development of what a state can and should do, both what their obligations are and also what their sort of best practices are in terms of a response. And I think you can develop those without pushing it all the way into the box of saying it's a military issue, right? Without saying, okay, this is Cybercom, this is for the Pentagon to deal with, or for the NSA. I think there needs to be a sort of whole conversation about, what are the non-military responses that we can do? And, I don't have a particular view on any of the, indemnification, questions you asked, but those are the type of questions I think we're kind of behind on. George?
Quite, those are good reflections of which to begin that discussion. Pat Lynn himself has written some very important opinion pieces on hacking back and on cyber stand your ground, analogy with that somewhat controversial Florida law, that there seems to be a certain amount of vigilantism permitted to commercial entities in the spaces between military, state activity and the states themselves behaving like individuals and criminals and inflicting harm on the commercial entities. Right now, we don't have a good mechanism for sorting that out, and certainly the fear that from a legal standpoint, a declaration of a thing as war does create unforeseen difficulties. I'm quite certain that most of the early advocates of cyber warfare as the right metaphor just hadn't thought that one through, and Pat has helped us with that. I favor allowing a greater latitude to establish commercial entities, Verizon or Chase Manhattan Bank or whatever it might be, to be able to engage in offensive defense, that is reactive or proactive defensive measures that inflict some punishment on, and therefore deterrent effect on entities, including state entities that would attack them and inflict harm. How to coordinate this in the end, as Jens has said, is I think just we don't have a robust enough set of distinctions and ascriptions of responsibility for this kind of thing. That is what makes the cyber conflict gray, as Pat rightly notes. So in the absence of that, I think a certain amount of self-determination and even quasi-vigilantism in the cyber domain are appropriate, as long as they themselves don't engage in worst kind of excesses that traditional vigilantism. You raise your posse and you catch the bad guys and you hang them, fine. But you get the wrong guys or you hang too many of them, then you've got a problem. And those are not trained officers of the law or recognized deputized officers of the law in the Old West phenomenon. This is going to be our problem if we permit a proactive defensive measures on the part of non-government entities.
Thank you, George.
Thanks, guys.
Jens, by the way, Henrik Seiss is here from Norway, and he was happy to be mentioned. So I had a question, Jens, for you then. So then how do we think about properly responding to this kind of harm? So there's a covert interference. Perhaps it was with the machine, perhaps it was with people's thinking, and perhaps it failed, perhaps it worked, but didn't result in violence, or did. I mean, there are all sorts of consequences you could spin out from this. So is there, like, say in the law, a body of thinking about how to proportionately respond to these various situations?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, the state of the law is in a a state of dispute right now. Especially, I mean, are you talking about cyber conflicts generally, or are you talking about election interference?
I'm talking about election interference. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think that the best response is to target the covert nature of the attack and to uncover the identity of the people engaged in the meddling. I don't think you target the meddling itself. You don't stop them from speaking. You don't stop them from, putting out their speech. But what you stop them from doing is putting up their speech anonymously and pretending to be someone they're not on social media. And if that means, pushing them off, Twitter or Facebook when you identify an account as being connected with a foreign troll farm, then you do that. I also think that it's very essential for the US government to, in real time, provide information to the public about foreign nations that are interfering in our elections. And that sounds like an obvious point, but that is actually not what the government has historically done. Why not? Because the response to foreign election interference has mostly been handled by counterintelligence agencies. Counterintelligence agencies have mostly been focused on keeping secrets, and the last thing they want do is disclose foreign threats to the American people, because when they do that, that means sharing the very secrets that they're trying to safeguard. But in this case, right, so like the CIA does not have a culture of disclosing anything to the United States because they're trying to protect secrets. The NSA is the same thing. They don't want to disclose things. Even the counterintelligence division of the FBI is not in the habit of disclosing stuff. The problem is the only way to stop foreign election interference that's covert from having the impact is to tell everyone, hey, Russia or Iran or China or whoever is doing that right now. And so keep that in mind when you're engaged in deliberation in the run-up to the election. Disclosing this information 6 months later after the election is too late because it doesn't have that kind of sanitizing effect. It's interesting. One way to do this is through indictments from the FBI to the Justice Department. I'm happy when the Justice Department starts indicting people, even if they're never going to be actually put to trial because we don't have custody of them, which is a funny kind of function of indictments in the criminal law. We usually don't think of the criminal law as being used in this way, but it's actually a clever way of using the criminal law, one, to provide attribution for the cyber attack, saying we know who did it and we're going to publicly say who did it, and also provide information to the public, which is, hey, this is going on, the Russians are doing this. But the thing is, it has to be done in a timely fashion.
Right. That's interesting. Thank you. We're getting close to 1:30, so the last question goes to Henrik Seiss.
I'll be very brief. We Norwegians are normally so quiet and introvert. We come across as covert anyway. No one knows what we're doing. Thank you very much to both of you. Very insightful presentations. I'll try to be really brief. If election interference is of a sort that actually encourages, say, a military party, so it's clear that all this information comes in covertly with the aim of actually encouraging military use of force, whether in a civil conflict or against someone else. Would that count as a possible act of war? I mean, these are borderline cases anyway, but one could see cyber being used, just as, you know, information campaigns were used before cyber, talk about Rwanda, for instance, in order to encourage actual use of armed force. Would that then count to you as a case of war? And once again, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Oh, George, did you want to go first? Do you want to say something?
Go ahead.
I'll just say very briefly that I think the issue of causation is very difficult, right? And my one concern about in that analysis is whether or not the causation is too attenuated, and whether or not having gone through an election that breaks the chain of causation, and you can't really attribute it back to the foreign actor in terms of generating a military response. But that's more just a comment rather than a decisive answer, because I would have to say the whole issue of causation within the context of cyber anything and cyber war is very, very tricky, because in fact, it's one of the hardest things for whether it's philosophers or lawyers is to draw the difficult distinctions, particularly the qualitative distinctions involved in proximate causation. You know, what breaks a chain of causation? If you launch a cyber attack, which causes ATMs to malfunction or causes the stock market to do X, Y, and Z, and then you can trace these downstream consequences and maybe trace even some deaths to that. I mean, at what point do you say that that's too distant a downstream consequence? I don't have a clear answer to that, except to say that in your example, I'm worried that causation was too attenuated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good.
That sounds about right. I mentioned that I was thinking about, started to mention, I was thinking about this issue of Rwanda in the context of not only disinformation, but hate speech in our own country as a causal element, just simply magnified in its scope and the ease of its dissemination via social media. But the same kind of talk by one group against another or about another, or misinforming the public about the other, went on in Rwanda for a year or so before the outbreak of violence. And it just struck me that this cyber, our current anxieties, both domestic and international, about this resembled that in a deeply troubling way. Now, no one I guess one could have said in the Rwandan case that with the benefit of hindsight, some kind of intervention of some sort might have helped avoid the genocide. There was no post facto real punishment for that. There was a peacekeeping force established, no military action taken against the perpetrators of violence as an accountability measure for what they did. It's hard to see how that would work for the reasons that Professor Ohlin suggests. It would be difficult to ascribe sufficiently robust causality to individual actors or for organizations to be able to, blow them up or arrest them and try them or something. So not sure how to fix that piece of it.
No, I think it's a great point. I mean, it just brings up the fact that there's just a lot of work to be done on these concepts. The way that action theory and culpability, what they mean for these situations. So thank you both for getting us going in that direction and bringing up some new distinctions. And I'm sure this is going to be a very fruitful discussion for a lot of people that attended. So thank you, Jens. We know you're wrestling with the law school and you're busy, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. This was wonderful. Really appreciate it.
Okay. And George, you're busy with other things.
Likewise.
Thank you. And I hope everyone can come back too.
Thank you.
All right. And tomorrow, the final day of the conference, we'll talk about lawfare with Ord Kittry and disinformation with Thomas Rid. So please come back, and that'll be the final day. And maybe we can stay around after and chat, since we can't see each other at the conferences as usual. So thanks to everyone for coming, and see you tomorrow, hopefully.
Yeah.